There is something that happens almost without anyone noticing. A person walks into a supermarket on a Tuesday afternoon, grabs a mango from Mexico, a cheese from France, a salmon from Norway, and coffee from Ethiopia, puts them all in the same cart, pays, goes home, and cooks. There is nothing extraordinary about that act for the person living it. But if you stop for a moment and think about what just happened, the scene becomes surprisingly difficult to explain. Those four products grew or were made in four different corners of the planet. They arrived on that shelf through routes crossing oceans, borders, and refrigeration systems that never fail. And all of it happened quietly, as if it had always been this way. It had not always been this way. For most of human history, eating depended on what was available nearby. Geography was destiny. You were born in a place, and you ate what that place produced. If the harvest was bad, there was hunger. If winter came early, whatever had not been preserved was lost. The distance between a city and its food supply was, in practical terms, nearly impossible to overcome. Transporting perishable food meant betting against time, and time always won. The problem was not a lack of will or commerce. The Romans moved olive oil and wine across the Mediterranean. Medieval merchants carried spices from Asia at prices that made them luxury goods. But those trade routes worked for dry, salted, fermented, or otherwise processed products. For fresh fruit, fresh meat, and dairy, the situation was entirely different. The speed of spoilage always outpaced the speed of any available means of transport. So what could not be transported fresh was preserved instead. Preservation techniques are as old as civilization itself. Drying, salting, smoking, fermenting, pickling, all are ways of delaying the inevitable. Reducing available moisture, creating hostile environments for bacteria, altering the chemistry of food so it lasts longer. They worked, but with clear limits. A cured ham could travel. A freshly slaughtered pig could not. An olive in brine crossed the Mediterranean. A ripe tomato barely made it to the next town in time. The conceptual leap came in the early 19th century, and it came, as so many things in history do, driven by war. Napoleon Bonaparte needed to feed armies on the move, and he offered a prize to anyone who could solve the problem of preserving food for long periods without spoilage. The answer came from a French cook and confectioner named Nicolas Appert. Appert did not fully understand why his discovery worked, because the concepts of bacteria and sterilization did not yet exist in scientific language. But he had observed something concrete. If food was placed in glass jars, sealed tightly, and boiled, the contents stayed preserved for months, years even. The logic behind his method was sound, even if he could not articulate it. Heat killed microorganisms. The seal prevented new ones from entering. The result was an environment where spoilage simply could not occur. Appert published his method in 1810 and won the prize. Shortly after, an Englishman named Peter Durand adapted the idea by replacing fragile glass with tin containers. Canning, as we know it today, was born. Heavy, imperfect, requiring a hammer and chisel to open in its earliest versions, but functional. Food could now travel through time. For decades, canning transformed military logistics and exploration. Polar expeditions, armies on campaign, ships on long voyages all began relying on canned meat, vegetables, and fruit. The idea that food cooked in London could be opened and eaten 6 months later in the Arctic was, for the era, something close to miraculous. But canning had a clear ceiling. It transformed food by cooking it, altering its texture and flavor. For fresh products, the solution had to come from somewhere else. Cold had always been an intuitive answer. In winter, meat lasted longer. The domestic ice boxes of the 19th century, nothing more than insulated cabinets packed with ice blocks, operated on that same basic principle. But natural ice had its own problems. It depended on the season, on geography, and transporting it was costly and inefficient. The natural ice industry became a massive business in the northeastern United States, with companies cutting blocks from frozen lakes in winter and storing them to sell through the summer. It was a business that depended on the weather and that, by its very nature, had an expiration date. Mechanical refrigeration changed that equation in a fundamental way. The physical principles that make it possible, the expansion of gases and the absorption of heat, were understood and practically applied during the second half of the 19th century. The Australian James Harrison built one of the first functional mechanical refrigeration machines around 1856. Carl von Linde in Germany refined ammonia compression systems in the 1870s. What had once required natural ice could now be produced artificially, continuously, and under controlled conditions. The most transformative application of this technology was not the household refrigerator. It was the refrigerated ship. In 1880, the Strathleben successfully transported 40 tons of frozen meat from Australia to Great Britain. The voyage took weeks. The meat arrived in perfect condition. That moment broke a barrier that had defined food commerce throughout all of prior history. For the first time, oceanic distances were no longer an obstacle for perishable products. Australia and New Zealand could export meat to Europe. Argentina began its rise as one of the world's leading beef suppliers. Countries with vast land and cattle capacity found markets that had previously been entirely out of reach. But refrigeration solved the problem of time, not completely the problem of space. Moving large volumes of cargo by sea remained complicated, slow, and expensive for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature. Loading and unloading ships was labor-intensive, required long stays in port, and generated enormous losses from damage and theft. Every type of cargo had its own particular way of being packed. Nets, crates, barrels. A ship could spend more time in port than at sea. The solution came in 1956, when a trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean had an idea that at the time seemed almost too obvious. Instead of unloading the cargo from trucks, why not put the truck directly on the ship? The evolution of that idea became the standardized steel container, a metal box of uniform dimensions that could be stacked, transferred from ship to train to truck without ever being opened, without its contents being handled at any point along the journey. Standardization was the key. When all containers share the same dimensions, ports can design cranes specifically built to move them. Ships can be engineered to stack them with mathematical precision. Trains and trucks can carry them without modification. The entire system becomes modular, interchangeable, and scalable. What once required days of labor from hundreds of dock workers could now be done in hours by machinery. The cost of ocean shipping dropped dramatically, and when moving something becomes cheap, the world reorganizes itself. The combination of refrigeration and containerization created the conditions for what is now known as the global cold chain, a continuous system in which food stays at a controlled temperature from the field or processing plant all the way to the supermarket shelf. A strawberry picked in Chile can be in a European grocery store days later, fresh, unprocessed, unchanged in any way, simply maintained at the right temperature at every step of the journey. This had consequences that go far beyond what ends up on a plate. It changed where food is produced. Countries with favorable climates and lower labor costs specialized in specific crops for export. It disrupted seasonal cycles. Today, it is possible to eat summer fruit in the middle of winter because it comes from the opposite hemisphere. It changed the scale of agriculture, which went from being largely local to being, in many cases, genuinely global. And it changed what people consider normal in their diets, because people in countries with long winters grew up expecting permanent availability of products their grandparents only knew at certain times of year. There is something profound in that. Seasonality was for millennia one of the fundamental structures of human life. Celebrations, agricultural cycles, regional cuisine, all were organized around what was available at a given moment. That structure did not vanish overnight, and it has not disappeared entirely, but it loosened in a significant way. The mango from Mexico that someone puts in their cart on a Tuesday is not just a mango. It is the visible result of a chain connecting a farm in Michoacán to a ship in the Pacific, to a port in Europe, to a refrigerated truck, to a warehouse, to a shelf. A chain that operates with a quiet precision that makes everything seem effortless. The distance stopped being a barrier in food not all at once, but in layers. First, preservation broke the limit of time. Then, mechanical refrigeration broke the limit of fresh products. Then, containers broke the limit of cost. Each layer built on the ones before it and expanded what was possible. What feels ordinary in a supermarket today is actually the visible edge of a network of innovations that took 2 centuries to build. And that is still changing.